Hello and welcome to Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. Thank you to those who have donated via Ko-fi, and if you'd like to make a small donation to keep the episodes dropping, then do check out the full details. That is on the link in the description, and thank you very much in advance. Now, the Essex coast is a key point on the East Atlantic flyaway with its miles of salt marshes and mudflats. And for this episode of Essex by the Sea, I'm here once again on the Essex coast, but I suppose standing on perhaps what was once London. To help explain this, I'm joined by Rachel Fancy, who's the RSPB site manager here at Wallasea Island. Thank you very much for having me on your island.
Hello, well thank you very much for coming, and you've chosen a nice day for it.
The sun is out, which is gorgeous, and it's gleaming off the water here, and I'm surrounded by loads of birds. I hope you can hear them in the background. Why is this part of the coastline important, first of all, to birds?
Well, as you said in your introduction, there's a lot of salt marshes and mudflats around, which are hugely important, particularly for our wintering birds who come down in the winter to feed on the mudflats, where it's a bit warmer than where they breed further north in the Arctic Circle and Scandinavia and places like that.
So basically they come here for their winter holidays where it's a little bit warmer, and that's what the East Atlantic flyaway is. Is that the route that the birds take then, basically?
Yes, they do. And then obviously in the summer they return to their breeding grounds further north and use that same flyway in reverse.
Fantastic. Now we're recording this, I suppose, late spring, early summer. The sun is shining through, the birds are in the background. What birds can we hear actually?
So the main birds that we can hear are skylarks, and there's one either side of us. Wallasea is quite well known for its sound as skylarks because we do have up to 200 pairs across the whole reserve, and they sing their hearts out to mark their territories, and so you occasionally get the little odd squabble, as you can imagine, between them.
Now, if anyone doesn't know where Wallasea Island actually is, we're just south of the River Crouch, just over there. If the seawall wasn't quite so high, I'd be able to see Burnham on Crouch as the birds fly. Not very far away. It's a very long drive to Burnham on Crouch, and you can actually check back because there is a little foot ferry that runs between Burnham and Wallasea that perhaps you can listen back to the episode that we recorded with them. How large is Wallasea Island, though?
So the RSPB reserve is 700 hectares, and from the visitor car park you can walk 3 kilometres east to get to the northeast corner of Wallasea Island, and it's sort of 2 kilometres from north to south as well. So we've got 15 kilometres of walking trail that people can do, so enough to keep you busy and get your exercise in.
You certainly could. And other than the bird sound, it is silent. It is so remote. You can see a long way. And it's just peaceful, just bird song everywhere. But Wallasea has undergone quite a transformation, hasn't it, over the last sort of decade? And if we was here perhaps 6-7 years ago, it would have been very different.
Yes, it certainly would. It was an arable farmland in up to 2011. So where we're standing would have been crops, and then Crossrail, who was the tunnelling project underneath London, building the railway that went from Shenfield towards Reading. They brought a lot of their material here and placed it at the eastern part of the site to form an area called Jubilee Marsh. They brought 3 million tonnes of soil, and it all came in by ship and got deposited onto a conveyor belt which brought it onto the island, and then the lorries took it to the exact locations where the design sort of specified it needed to be. So it made a sea wall in order that the sea could come in, but obviously only so far, and then it filled up to the area in between to make the different habitats from mudflats all the way through the different salt marsh gradations up to the grassland.
That's something that I've noticed whilst being here on Wallasea for a very short time. There are sort of pools of water all over the place. It's not one just flat land island. There's one just to the left here. There's another one that's a wiggly sort of shape to our right. And that's all been created by this work then, is it?
So some of the area where we're standing at this moment these creeks were dug out actually by Crossrail as well, and that soil was taken to add to the material brought from the tunnels. And the area that I described, Jubilee Marsh, is just over to the east from us, so sort of a kilometre-ish to the east, and it's the sort of eastern third of the RSPB reserve, and they made that land higher. So actually where we are now, we're actually on the old Wallasea land level, and the Crossrail built it up higher. And the reason they had to do that was because where we are now, we're actually below sea level. So if we made a hole in the seawall, you can imagine how much water would come on and off being below sea level.
I think it's safe to say we'd get wet.
We would definitely get wet. We'd need more than waders. We would need a diving suit, I think. Yeah. So in order to reduce that amount of water coming on and off, Crossrail filled the hole, in effect, with material. And that meant less water comes on and off each tide. It meant it was manageable, like the estuaries weren't going to be affected by that amount of water coming on and off. And also by bringing that material in, it allowed the RSPB to design the habitats exactly how they wanted, because we'd got all this soil and we could put it exactly how we wanted. Obviously we needed the seawall, a new seawall, but everywhere inside we could put it exactly how we wanted.
And that must have been quite a unique opportunity, because Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth line, I mean, that doesn't happen very often, that kind of level of and size of project. So this is a one-off almost.
Yes, almost a one-off, yes. Definitely a really good partnership that sort of happened in the sense by chance in some ways, in that the RSPB was looking for material and Crossrail was happening, and sometimes these things don't quite line up, but in this case it did, and it allowed Crossrail to get rid of their material in a very sustainable way by not only bringing it round by ship and therefore saving lots of road journeys, but also making a nature reserve at the end of it. And
that nature reserve is not just a case of creating the pools and the land and letting it be. There is a lot that's still managed as well, and will continue to be managed.
Yes, so myself and a couple of other members of staff, as well as all our volunteers, help to manage the site. So the sea does a lot of work for us, but some of the lagoons we can manage the water levels. So for instance, in winter we might flood them up and let all the seed go out into the water, so that the ducks that come down from the north that I mentioned before, they can feed on those seeds. And then in the spring we might lower the water level so that islands appear for breeding birds like black-headed gulls and common terns and avocets, and they all use those islands to breed on. So we do manipulate things in some of the lagoons, and in other places like in Jubilee Marsh, the sea comes in and it goes out and it just does all the work for you.
That was something I noticed. You mentioned about managing that water level. As I drove down the track, which is a very long track from the first point, you really realise you're coming onto a nature reserve. I've noticed that there are solar panels and sort of sluices, and that's how you manage those water levels, is it?
That is, yes. Some of the sluices would have been here when it was farmland, and they would have been used to drain the farmland of water when it was wet, because obviously the farmers didn't want their crops getting wet. But we actually use the same sluices but bring water onto our lagoons. So water comes in from the Crouch in the north or the Roach in the south and fills the lagoons as we want. And as you say, there's also solar panels, and they just feed small pumps which allow us just to take water into different areas. So for instance, in the summer we can fill some scrapes with water if there's not been any rain. We can just put the solar pump on and it will take some water out of the lagoon and feed it into some of the tiny little scrapes.
I guess though it's all very well creating the land and the lagoons and the ponds and the lakes and things for the birds to have somewhere to come, but they need food. So I'm guessing it's not just the birds then that the RSPB look after, because you've got to have something here for the birds to feed on, isn't it? It's a big life cycle.
It certainly is. When I say the sea comes in and manages it for us, obviously the sea brings in lots of sediments. It'll bring in roots and seeds, and then the vegetation can take hold, and also in the sediments we'll get lots of invertebrates, so little worms and larvae of different insect life, and that's what the birds love to eat, the ones that probe in the mud. Otherwise some of them just sit and pick things off from the tops of the mud. Again, wet soil is very important to a lot of birds' life cycles. And then other things like raptors that we have here, so things like the marsh harrier and hen harrier in the winter, well, they rely on small mammals to eat. So again, this grassland that we've got around us is perfect for the small mammals and therefore perfect for the wintering raptors that we have here.
Can't see any today. But that's probably because we're standing in the middle of their habitat, making a noise. So they're keeping their distance, other birds, but you can hear them in the background. And as we were walking to this particular point on Wallasea Island, you did point out one of the little beetles that was scurrying across the path. Beetle, I've never seen before. There must be quite some rare wildlife here because of the work that you're doing.
Yes, that beetle was called a black oil beetle, and it does seem to have a particular liking for Wallasea Island. It was here in small numbers before, but hopefully we've created the habitat that it seems to now spread further away from the seawalls and likes more of the habitat in from those as well. And it's seen in springtime, so April, start of May, depending on the weather conditions a bit. And it's quite a big chunky beetle, as you saw, so it's quite easy to spot, and it seems to like edges of paths. I think it's where the long grass and the short grass meet. And yes, I know as we were discussing, it's got a rather unusual life cycle. Obviously the adults are out at this time of year and they'll lay their eggs, and the young that hatch from that, the little larvae, I think they're called triangulins, climb up grass stems and attach themselves to bee legs. And then the bees take them off to the burrows without knowing it, and they fall off and they eat the food that the bees have stored in there for their own young. So completely dependent on the bees for the completion of their life cycle.
That is amazing. And so therefore the flowers, the flora and fauna that you have around the island is also critical too for that life cycle then?
Yes, that's true. Yes, so we do we do have to cut some of our grass. The cows do some of it for us, but we also do cut things. And we do cut things at different times in order to try and keep some flower-rich habitat. And so we've got quite a lot of clovers and trefoils along the sea walls, which bees love as well. Now,
we can hear the skylark still in the background. If we just turn around, we're looking sort of inland now, back towards Canewdon and sort of Southend in the distance to our left. What sort of birds can we see there? I can see some white ones in the distance.
Yes, so on those islands that you're looking at in the middle of the lagoon, the white birds there are predominantly black-headed gulls, but we also have Mediterranean gulls and common terns on those islands. So the gulls tend to start breeding first, and then the common terns, because they migrate up from Africa, they've only just started arriving and breeding the last couple of weeks, so they sort of fill in the gaps around the edges that the gulls haven't already filled up with their nests. As you get closer to the lagoon, you can hear the gulls in the background. And that's the skylark coming down to land that we can just hear there.
Skylarks don't land though, do they?
Yeah, they do land when they need to feed, and also they nest in the grass as well, so they'll nest on the ground. They're a ground nesting bird. So the reason we see them up so much is because that's where they like to sing, and that's when you notice them, I think, because they're making a noise.
Yeah, that literally came down to head height and then just skimmed the top of the tall grasses as we were talking there. Now, we've talked about the vastness of Wallasea Island. Obviously, you are the site manager. You can't manage this all on your own. You've got a team of people that help you to do that. And some of those are volunteers, aren't they?
They are, yeah. Our volunteers are actually critical to Wallasea being a success. So they help us with all sorts of things. So we do survey the site for, as you can imagine, birds, but other things as well, like butterflies, waterfoals, and they help us with all of that because we can't cover the site ourselves without those extra eyes and ears. And they talk to people, visitors that come to the site, and we have a small car park which is open every day, but often the volunteers are around to talk to people, and they also help us manage some of the habitats. So where we want to do something specific, they'll come in and help us, or put some fencing in or a bit of signage, that type of thing, and help us do sort of practical tasks as well.
If that appeals to somebody perhaps who's listening to the podcast, perhaps is considering about helping out, where can people find out information? I guess the RSPB website.
Yes, the RSPB website does list all sorts of opportunities, whether that's at Wallasea or other reserves in Essex or across the country. You can do local reserves, or you can go and do something that's residential volunteering, where you can go away for a couple of weeks to some place that you'd like to visit and do some volunteering at the same time.
Just as you were saying that, I was put off slightly because there were two ducks that came into land. I know that's a mallard. That's about as far as my bird knowledge goes. When you are here on a site like this, I guess it's probably hard to have a particular favourite spot, but is there?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to have a particular favourite, but one of the things I do like about Wallasea, and you get this wherever you are actually, is that you can see the sky. There's a big skyscraper around you as well as the landscape, because you are in quite a flat site, well, as a lot of the Essex coast is, but because there's not much infrastructure around, we can see the sky 360 degrees around us, which on a day like today is lovely, and obviously can be a bit bleak in winter.
Yeah, it is huge sky here. As you say, there isn't much infrastructure in place. There's some farm buildings over by the Essex Marina. I can just about see the tops of some wind turbines over on the Dengie Peninsula. Just spinning around, looking out now towards the North Sea and the wider Thames estuary. There's a crane right over there in the distance, probably on Wallasea Island, I'm guessing.
Yep, Wallasea.
Which itself is a very remote place, and maybe one day there'll be an episode from there. But it is a brilliant place to come, and if you want to just escape the world, then maybe come and visit Wallasea Island.
Yeah, that would be great. As I said, the car park is here and we're open 7 days a week, so any time from 8 a.m. till dusk.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much for inviting me along here to Wallasea Island and telling us about all the work that you're doing here, and good luck with the future work that will go on well into the future here, keeping it a wildlife haven that it is.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
If you're enjoying the episode, feel free to leave a comment or give a rating on wherever you get your podcasts from, so others might well discover the Essex coast like you have. Until the next episode, thanks very much for listening.